Okay, today we're going to be looking at the last section of Chapter 11. We're going to continue talking about pollution, but now we're going to extend it to, besides just any general pollution, we're going to focus specifically on groundwater pollution and ocean pollution. So we're going to talk about, again, two types of water pollution, but we're going to focus on those two. We're going to talk about why groundwater pollution is so difficult to clean. We're going to look at what are the major sources of ocean pollution and explain the effects of pollutions on ecosystems. And we're going to finish up with what are some of the laws that have been designed to improve water quality in the United States. This is Roman numeral 4, groundwater and ocean pollution and United States water pollution laws. A major threat to water quality is in the contamination of groundwater. Now, number one, groundwater provides drinking water for 1/2 of all Americans. Anybody who uses well water is using groundwater. And in a lot of locations, they don't have as much surface water as we do here in Alabama. So in a lot of places where there is a lack of surface water, groundwater is all they have. Number 2, pollution enters groundwater when the water seeping from the surface dissolves pollutants and carries them with the water into the underground aquifers. Now, we have talked about groundwater before. We haven't really looked at it from this perspective. B, once groundwater becomes polluted, it is essentially irreversible. This is because it takes so long for the groundwater to replace itself due to very slow movement. If you'll remember, groundwater is not like an underground lake. Groundwater, an aquifer, is a rock formation, and the rock is very porous, so it can have water in it. If you've ever dripped water on any kind of sandstone, which is a rock, the water just soaks into it. Well, that's kind of what we're talking about here. So you can imagine the water doesn't just flow through it easily. In addition, it's difficult to reach, and the rock formations that hold the water may also retain the pollution. So, if you've got water dripping down from the surface, anything that it passes through, it can dissolve and take with it, including pollution. So if you look in this picture, you can see what happens is, so that any pesticides or fertilizers that you have on the ground, on the surface, if it rains on it, as the water soaks down through, it picks some of those up and brings it with it. If you have a septic tank and it leaks, then that can leak down into the groundwater. Anything that you have, like for instance, a landfill, then it rains on it just like it does everywhere else, so the water soaks down through it and picks up whatever's in the landfill, dissolves some of it, and eventually it all ends up down underground in the aquifer. Now, because that water moves so slowly, then that pollution stays there for a long time. Well, let's say that the water does move through. The problem is that you've now got pollution that is stuck to the rocks. So then it continues to contaminate the water. So prevention appears to be the only solution. Once you've got contaminated groundwater, then it's going to be contaminated for a long, long time, like thousands of years. See, this is different from surface water in that flowing rivers will dilute many waste and renew the oxygen supply if not overloaded with pollution. If you can stop the pollution into a river, and it will clean itself up in a matter of years. It may take a couple of decades, but that's very different than groundwater. So you've got all of this stuff floating in the water. Now, it's not going to dissolve the plastic, but eventually the plastic will a lot of times collect over in one place, and the remaining water will then clean up. Number one, because lakes, now remember this is lakes, not rivers, because lakes don't flow, it can take up to 100 years for them to clean themselves of pollution. Now that's if you stop polluting it. It can take up to 100 years. So it might take a decade or two for a river to clean itself up. A lake, it may take about 100 years. Number two, in comparison, because groundwater is located in rock formations with very little movement, it may take thousands of years for an aquifer to clean itself of pollution. So, you have all of this soaking down through, so by the time you get down here to the aquifer, the water is just stored in cracks and pores. And so if that becomes polluted, it may be thousands of years before it has cleaned up. D, at least 85% of ocean pollution comes from activities on land. So, in other words, even though the ocean is as big as it is, 70% of the surface, it can become polluted very quickly because of rivers and streams emptying into it. Number one, most pollution reaches the oceans from rivers emptying into the ocean. So if you pollute the rivers, it's going to eventually end up in the oceans. And if you look at what kind of pollutants we're talking about with this graph, sewage is the biggest one. And that's gross and disgusting, I know, but that's just the way it is. Then you get 20% that's farm runoff, 20% that's from air pollutants. Now, how in the world do air pollutants get in the water? Well, everywhere that you find the surface of the water, you have contact between the water and the air. So any pollution in the air can get mixed in with the surface water. And then you have other things like maritime transportation, that's like boats, industrial wastewater, offshore oil, litter. So those are the kind of pollutants that we're talking about in the oceans. Number two, another source of ocean pollution comes from direct dumping from industry. Number three, oil spills are another source of ocean pollution. Now, what makes oil spills so bad is because oil has the ability to spread out into a thin layer that may only be a few molecules thick. So you can take 1 gallon of oil can pollute millions of gallons of water because it has that ability to spread so far. So when the Horizon oil rig began leaking back several years ago in the Gulf of Mexico, that oil was millions of gallons of oil that was coming out. And today a lot of people think, oh, it's cleaned up, but there are a lot of that oil that by clumping together and clumping around other kinds of pollution has settled to the bottom. We really don't know all the damage that it's done. When you've got oil that's sitting on the surface, like this picture, any critters, whether it's fish, birds, whatever, that tries to move between the water and the air or the land is going to get coated with this oil. Since oceans are so big, they can dilute a large amount of pollution. Before there were so many people, we weren't really worried about it because they could take some pollution, and by the time it got diluted, then it really didn't have an impact. However, there are limits, especially close to shorelines where most ocean pollution occurs. Protecting coastlines is difficult because much of it is privately owned and because there are many types of ecosystems requiring individual solutions. Coastlines have the greatest amount of biodiversity for oceans. That's where you find the biggest part of it. And there is a lot of it. And so, depending on what type of land you have located in that area, the ecosystem may change every 10 miles. Well, that means there's not a one-size-fits-all solution for helping with pollution. If plastics present particularly difficult problems in the oceans because they don't break down easily. I mean, basically, they don't really break down at all. They may break into smaller pieces, but they don't go away. If you look at this graphic, notice the writing up here. Up to 63.4 billion plastic water bottles are dumped into landfills and the ocean every single year. Now, 63.4 billion, think about that. We have 8 billion people or 7 billion people on the planet. But there's lots of places on the earth that they don't have plastic water bottles. So the majority of this is coming from developed countries. Number one, organisms mistake it for food and it can destroy their digestive tract. So we're talking about plastics that get in the ocean. In this diagram, it shows you a turtle trying to eat a plastic bag. They don't know that it's plastic. They think it's food. 100 million sea mammals are killed each year from consuming plastic in the ocean. Number two, organisms get tangled in the plastics and may die, like fishing line or plastic bags that are now in strips. Those little round ring things that hold, if you go in the store and buy the canned Cokes and the little rings that hold them together, they can get tangled in that also. G, each year, approximately 37 million gallons of oil from tanker accidents are spilled into the oceans. Every year, as many as 200 million to 300 million gallons of oil enter the ocean from non-point sources on land. That's almost 10 times the amount of oil spilled by tankers. Now, remember what we said non-point sources are. Those are things like oil residue on roads that when it rains gets washed into the water supply. So that would be examples of non-point sources. So that's how much is getting washed into rivers and then into oceans because of non-point. H, of particular importance in water pollution is biomagnification. Now, the word bio means life. Magnification means you make it bigger. And so when pesticides and other pollutants are added to the water supply, those pollutants can be consumed by fish. Now, one individual fish may not be hurt by it, but if some other organism eats a bunch of those fish, all of those pollutants then end up in the bigger organism, like people. So the pollutants then move up the food chain, multiplying with each step. Eventually, the organisms at the top may contain enough of the pollutant to become toxic to the organism. So, for instance, the people at the top or the organisms at the top of a food chain, that means that they're going to eat a bunch of that food, and all of the individual critters or fish contribute to the total amount that you end up within the apex predator, the one at the top. So this diagram kind of shows what we're talking about. Number one, contaminants are washed into the water and they build up in the sediment. So down here at the bottom. Then bottom-dwelling organisms such as mussels of different kinds concentrate the contaminants and are then eaten by other small fish. Then predator species continue to concentrate the toxins by eating the smaller fish. And then those predator species fish are then consumed by humans. And each step up the food chain, you have more and more of the pollutant there. Because no one owns the oceans, it is difficult to enforce international laws relating to ocean pollution. Most countries that have an ocean border claim a certain distance out into the ocean, but they're only allowed to claim a certain amount, a certain number of miles offshore. Number one, every country claims ocean territory of 3 to 12 miles offshore. But open ocean is not under control of anyone. So we can pass all the laws we want to, but they're only going to apply to within that 3 to 12 miles offshore of that country's coastline. Once you get past that, it's hard to enforce laws. All right, so for example, in this diagram, you have Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Well, Colombia contains this much. You can have internal waters; those are the ones that's right against the shore. And then you can have territorial waters, which extend off, the 3 to 12 miles. This picture's not really to scale. And then you can have economic zones, which extend out even further, but then you're getting into real iffy territory about being able to enforce laws. So if you'll notice, Peru claims this area, Ecuador this area, Ecuador also claims this area. Then you get into some problem down here in the corner where there's some overlap, where there's dispute. But the part I'm interested in is this part out here. That means that people on this island and people on this shoreline, they can pollute this area right here, and no one has any say-so about it. There's no laws you can enforce right here because it is not claimed by a particular country. Number 2, an example is that it is against international law to dump oil, plastics, or toxins in the ocean. Well, that's international law, but who's going to enforce it? So, as a result, marine refuges have been created to protect endangered ocean species, kind of like the wildlife refuge up around the Tennessee River and near Decatur. Well, we also have some of those on shorelines. So this is the coastline of California. These blue lines right here represent a protection site. So you have protection for a certain marine species, but you also then, because some of these species are fish, notice the darker red, those are areas where there is no fishing allowed. Now they don't try to say the whole coastline has no fishing, but they do have certain areas where it's not allowed. And then there's other areas, the orange color, are where it is limited. You can have some fishing. And what that means is there are certain things living in those areas where they are endangered species. So you have some regulation going on in order to try to improve the ecosystems in that area. J, one of the most important pieces of environmental legislation passed by the U.S. Congress is the Clean Water Act in 1972. Its purpose is to restore and maintain the chemical, biological, and physical integrity of the nation's waters. Now, there are some issues about that. How do you have enough manpower to enforce this? Number 1, the goal was to make all surface water in the United States safe for fishing and swimming by 1983. Although this goal was not achieved, it led to the enactment of similar water quality legislation in most states. So in other words, where the federal government couldn't regulate or didn't have the manpower, it caused states to decide they were going to do the same thing. In Alabama, this was huge because we have so much surface water. So we also have clean water acts in this state that help to protect the water from people just being able to pollute however they want to. Number 2, the Clean Water Act also paved the way for other water quality legislation. For example, the Superfund Act of 1980 makes owners, operators, and customers of hazardous waste sites responsible for the cleanup of those sites. So in other words, if let's say you have a business and they have a hazardous waste dump. Well, let's say they go out of business and they some of the way they were storing the hazardous waste then breaks open and now begins to pollute area around it. Well, they can, if that company is still around in some form, they are allowed to go and sue them or penalize them to make them come back and clean it up. The other thing that helps is if they've gone out of business or if it is something that was in business before this was enacted. This is a fund with money in it that has a way to help pay for cleaning up those sites. When you look at this map, each red dot represents a Superfund site, a place where the people who caused the pollution are no longer in business, and so because of that, now there's nobody to clean it up. So this Superfund then provides money to help do that. The Water Quality Act of 1987 is supporting state and local efforts to clean polluted runoff. It also established loan funds to pay for new wastewater treatment plants and created programs to protect major estuaries. So in other words, this helped to support efforts to clean up the water because it's an expensive process. Building the plant to do it and then maintaining it takes a lot of money. So this was an act that helped to support that. The last one, the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, requires any oil tankers in American waters to have a double hull. Now, why that would be important? Well, if you have only one hull and there is a leak, then that oil is going out in the ocean. But if you have a double hull, then even if the outer hull develops a leak, the inner hull can protect it till you can get somewhere to get it repaired. So now all ships that come in, oil tankers that come into American waters are required to have this. And that's all for today.